let her get away, Mommy? I won't, Jason. I won't.
Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and maniacal mamas. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at Friday the 13th. Took me long enough to cover this franchise, huh? This classic 1980 slasher follows a group of soon-to-be camp counselors who have arrived to work at the grand reopening of Camp Crystal Lake. The kids come to regret ignoring the locals' warnings of doom when they find themselves being stalked by a brutal killer. As they're slashed, shot, and stabbed, the counselors struggle to stay alive against a merciless opponent. For a lot of people, Friday the 13th is the single most cherished horror franchise in history. It helped launch the onslaught of low-budget slashers that would come to define the 80s, bringing a huge variety of violence along the way. Jason Voorhees has become a household name, and his iconic hockey mask and machete are an unmistakable image that would be replicated and parodied for generations to come. It's usually the franchise horror YouTubers start with, as it has something for just about everybody to enjoy. Over the next 10 months, I'll be going through all 12 Friday films as we watch Jason transform from a deformed boy, an undead killing machine, a nasty-ass hellspawn, and a fucking robot in his increasingly chaotic outings that have left hordes of happy campers in pieces. But as any good Friday fan knows, Jason is not the killer in the original. That distinction goes to his vengeful mama, Pamela Voorhees. Friday the 13th was directed by Sean S. Cunningham, who has brought us films like Spring Break, The New Kids, and Deep Star 6. He's also produced a ton of films like The Last House on the Left, all of the House films, and quite a few Friday the 13th sequels. After working with Wes Craven on The Last House on the Left, he got really inspired to make his own horror movie, taking particular inspiration from John Carpenter's Halloween. Late 70s films like Black Christmas and Halloween are credited for creating the slasher template, but Friday the 13th is the film that ignited the slasher boom by inspiring a slew of low-budget copycats. The screenplay was written by Victor Miller, who is best known for his work on soap operas like All My Children, General Hospital, and Guiding Light. He and Cunningham worked on a lot of early films together, but unfortunately they've been at each other's throats in a 5-year lawsuit over the copyright for the title, script, and characters of the original movie. As far as I can tell, Miller was recently awarded rights, but with all of the legal tape, I don't see us getting a new Friday anytime soon. This was a low-budget affair, around $550,000, so Cunningham placed likability and affordability over actual talent when it came to casting the young camp counselors. These roles went to Adrian King from Inherit the Wind, All-American Bully, and Butterfly Room, Harry Crosby, and pretty much his only acting role, although he is the son of Bing Crosby, Janine Taylor from The Royal Romance of Charles and Diana, and stage productions like Robert and Elizabeth. Laurie Bartram from Emergency, The House of Seven Corpses, and Another World. Kevin Bacon from Footloose, Tremors, and Apollo 13. I've covered a lot of Bacon on the channel recently. Mark Nelson from Bloodhounds of Broadway, The First Wives Club, and The Rewrite. And Robbie Morgan from Me, Natalie, I Married a Centerfold, and Dutch Hollow. Pamela Voorhees was played by Betsy Palmer from Queen Bee, The Time of Your Life, and The Last Angry Man. At the time, she was the only recognizable name, and she only took the role because she needed to buy a new car. Jason Voorhees, who is just a lumpy little guy in this film, was played by 15-year-old Ari Lehman. He's gone on to have a career in punk music, but has also recently returned to horror in films like The Barn, Rock Paper Dead, and The Lurker. Friday was shot on a working Boy Scout camp in New Jersey, which actually still runs today. Cinematography was handled by Barry Abrams, who has shot films including Here Come the Tigers, The Children, and A Stranger is Watching. Soon-to-be legendary special effects artist Tom Savini was brought in for the kills and Jason's prosthetics. And the score was composed by Harry Manfredini, a prolific musician who has composed for films like Swamp Thing, Slaughter High, and Wishmaster. He took a cue from Jaws and pretty much only played music when the actual killer was present to eventually indicate to the audience when to be afraid. Distribution companies fought tooth and nail for what they knew would be a low-budget hit, with Paramount ultimately winning with $1.5 million. That was a small price to pay, with Friday the 13th blowing up at the box office, eventually bringing in $60 million. It was the second highest grossing horror of the year, only behind The freaking Shining. The film was not loved by critics, who found the actors talentless, the direction directionless, and the plot devoid of any substance. There was some praise for the cinematography and score, but it was almost unanimously derided for its depictions of graphic violence. It has been somewhat reappraised through the years though, as its importance to horror history is hard to deny. It currently has a 63 and 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, which I'd say is a pretty fair rating for it. The first Friday ended up being an odd inclusion in the franchise for obvious reasons, and it has some really great qualities along with some not so good ones. But it's probably time we start looking at those qualities ourselves. I hope y'all don't mind a little death curse, cause we're watching Friday the 13th. The movie opens at Camp Crystal Lake in the year 1958, where a group of happy-go-lucky counselors are singing the night away. As a spooky POV sneaks through a cabin, counselors Barry and Claudette decide to sneak off for some hanky-panky. The POV follows the lovebirds up the loft of a cabin, and the teens are too worried about getting in trouble to realize the danger they're in. Jackson takes a stab to the gut, and despite Claudette's feeble escape efforts, she too is killed in a freeze frame. We jump ahead to Friday the 13th in 1980, where a young lady named Annie is hiking through the small town of Crystal Lake. The townspeople are distraught to hear that the infamous Camp Blood is opening back up, but a friendly and slightly perverted man named Enos offers to drop her off closer to the campground. The ominous warnings continue with Crazy Ralph, who tells Annie she'll never leave Camp Blood.
It's got a death curse!
Damn, even Enos can't help but gossip about the camp's history, telling Annie a boy drowned in 57 and 2 counselors were murdered in 58. Every attempt to reopen the camp has resulted in fires or poisoned water, and nobody has ever been caught in relation to those crimes. He tells Annie she should quit while the quitting's good. He drops her off about 10 miles from the camp, and we switch to a new crew of incoming counselors as they arrive at the campground. From right to left, we've got Jack, Marcy, and Ned. This shirtless gentleman is the new owner, Steve Christie, and this is another counselor named Alice. Christie immediately puts the kids to work, and he immediately starts to flirt with Alice once he has her alone. She's considering leaving before the kids even arrive, but he convinces her to stick around for another week in case she warms up to the place. We meet the last 2 counselors, one named Bill and the other Brenda. Christie tells the group to keep an eye out for Annie while he heads to town, and Ned gives Brenda a scare on the archery range. We rejoin Annie as she hitches a ride with an unseen driver, but the chatty counselor notices when they drive right past the camp. She jumps from the speeding Jeep when it doesn't stop and flees into the woods as the driver follows. Annie thinks she loses her assailant, only to walk right into a throat slashing. The counselors have opted to hang out at the lake instead of working, and Brenda almost realizes they're being watched from the trees. Ned starts drowning, but of course it's just a ploy to steal a kiss from Brenda. Well, there goes your shot at being the final girl, Brenda. The killer will surely remember that blunder. Alice is terrified by a black snake in her cabin, and the counselors unite to murder the innocent creature. This poor thing actually got chopped up on set, and the snake's owner had no idea the filmmakers were intending to kill it. That is super fucked and really disappointing they did that for such a throwaway scene. A cop arrives just in time to see Ned being racist, and he starts accusing the counselors of smoking the devil's lettuce. He's really out here to look for Crazy Ralph, as he was last seen pedaling to the camp preaching his words of doom. He's called back to the station, leaving the kids with a vague threat.
We ain't gonna stand for no weirdness out here.
Perfect timing for Ralph to emerge from a pantry with more warnings to leave. Okay, bye! Alice notices the power has gone out, but luckily Jack knows how to start up the emergency generator. Ned is watching Jack and Marcy get touchy when he notices someone outside his cabin, and he foolishly follows them in. Marcy and Jack aren't far behind, and as a storm approaches, she shares a recurring childhood nightmare about it raining blood. They head into the cabin to avoid the storm, and they get to doinking in the bunk below Ned's corpse. Meanwhile, Alice, Bill, and Brenda hunker down in a different cabin and they opt to smoke some grass and play a game of strip Monopoly. Marcy goes for a post-coitus pee, and Jack's post-coitus smoke is interrupted by an arrow to the throat. Now that right there is how you kill Kevin Bacon. Marcy follows a noise in the showers as she's washing up, which promptly leaves an axe lodged in her forehead. Strip Monopoly is interrupted by the wind, and Brenda heads out to make sure her windows are shut. We finally check in on Steve Christie, who has apparently been sipping coffee at the diner all day. His car gets stuck on the way back, and an officer offers him a lift back to the camp. Brenda heads to the bathrooms as well and doesn't notice as the killer slips away. She crawls into bed to enjoy a good book when she hears a child calling for help in the storm, and of course the cries lead her to the archery range. The killer turns on the floodlights, and the last we hear from Brenda is a scream. Alice noticed the lights and the scream, so she and Bill decide to check Brenda's cabin. It's here they notice a bloody axe hidden in a bed, at which point they realize everyone is missing. They break into Christie's office in the hope of calling for help, but the line has been cut. Damn, and all of the vehicles have been tampered with. Alice logically has a bad feeling about all this, but Bill convinces her it's all a big joke or misunderstanding. The cop gets called away before they reach the camp, so Christie has to walk the rest of his way alone. As soon as he returns, he's met with a flashlight to the face, and he recognizes the person behind it. And he's promptly stabbed to death off-screen. Alice inexplicably falls asleep, I guess, leaving Bill to check the generator on his own. Yeah, Bill isn't coming back from the shed alive. Alice wakes from a nightmare and goes searching for Bill, only to find his body pinned to the door with arrows. She flees to her cabin and tries to barricade it and arms herself with a skewer and baseball bat. Brenda's still barely alive body gets yeeted through the window, but Alice regains hope when she sees what she thinks is Steve's Jeep pull up. She rushes outside only to find an unfamiliar face.
How are you? Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
Mrs. Voorhees seems very unconcerned with Alice's story about dead counselors, only blaming this violence on the camp's bad luck. Time for some exposition.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those two others were killed? The counselors weren't paying any attention. They were making love while that young boy drowned.
Turns out Jason was Mama Voorhees' son, and she worked at the camp as a cook. She says Jason was a poor swimmer and should have been watched, and she remembers the sight of her son drowning and crying for help. She shares that it's also Jason's birthday, and she just couldn't let Christie reopen this place. She begins to blame Alice for Jason's death, envisioning her as one of the counselors who failed to save him. Pamela charges her with a knife, but Alice is able to take her down with the fire poker. But she obviously doesn't go for a double tap. Inside Pam's Jeep, she finds dead Annie, and dead Christie magically falls from something he's hanging on to. Pam watches her flee into the night, revealing how deep her persona of Jason has taken over.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
Alice returns to Christie's office to grab a shotgun as Pam turns the lights back on, but unfortunately the shells are locked away. She makes very feeble attempts to thwart Pam's advances, but the vengeful mama starts slapping her silly and tosses her into a table. Alice proves to have more fight in her though, and clocks Mama Voorhees with the gun before fleeing again. She successfully hides from Pam and doubles back to her cabin, and she seems to successfully hide again as Pam searches the cabin. Just kidding. Pam breaks down the door only for Alice to conquer with a frying pan. Then Alice decides to sit in a canoe for some reason, once again allowing Mrs. Voorhees to engage her in one-on-one combat. Pam has the upper hand before Alice kicks her away, and the final girl grabs her machete to suddenly behead the killer. Pamela's headless body shakes her very hairy hands at God before collapsing, and Alice paddles out into the lake to ensure her safety. The cops arrive the next morning to find Alice floating along, but just as she feels relief, she is suddenly snatched by Jason and pulled into the lake. She awakens in a hospital, with that last sequence apparently being a dream, but Alice is convinced that Jason was really there. The cop tells her they didn't find any little boys, and Alice says Jason must still be down there. The movie ends with what looks like a little ripple coming from inside the lake. And that's Friday the 13th. Even without Jason front and center, this film is so easy to enjoy. It's not swinging for the fences or trying too hard. It's just a dumb fun horror movie with occasional moments of greatness sprinkled in. Pamela is such an unexpected villain. I wonder how many people were shocked upon their first viewing back in 1980. There were obviously women as the villains in horror films before, but the use of POV shots and the limited images we get of the killer before her reveal lead us to assuming the killer is a man. It's a very interesting rug to pull out from the audience. It's also pretty downplayed just how much she has done up to this film. Like, Pamela has spent decades ensuring this camp doesn't reopen. Betsy Palmer's performance as Pam is definitely the most memorable of the film. Well, maybe second, right behind Crazy Ralph. The counselors all do a fine job, but even future greats like Kevin Bacon aren't given much to flex their stuff with. These are just your average, run-of-the-mill, dumb, fun-loving, sex-having teenagers. These characters do genuinely feel like real people though, as opposed to the cliche-ridden stereotypes we'll be seeing a lot of in the future. It's also important to note that this is the campground horror movie. Films like The Evil Dead popularized cabin horror a year later, and films like The Burning, Madman, and Sleepaway Camp were quick to follow, but as far as I can tell, Friday the 13th was the first to do it. There's definitely campground horror that has surpassed the original Friday the 13th, some of which is in this franchise, but you can't deny just how influential that is. And I've already mentioned that Friday is the spark that ignited the slasher boom, so despite any complaints I have nothing but appreciation for Friday the 13th. That being said, this movie is far from perfect. For a film that was pretty notorious at the time for its ultra-violence, most of the kills here are pretty tame. That being said, Jack's death is really outstanding, and Marcy's, Annie's, and Pamela's are solid as well. I just wish a few less of them were off-screen. But my biggest complaint is definitely the pacing and editing. There is just way too much time spent watching characters walking around, brushing their teeth, playing board games, and making coffee. If 10 minutes were shaved off this film, it would be a lot leaner and meaner, as a lot of the filler is intercut with the kill sequences. The only time this changes is after Pamela's reveal. After that jolt of energy, the finale stays pretty fun and consistent. A lot of the night shots are way too dark to see anything, but aside from that, I think the cinematography is fine with a few really interesting shots in there. Filming on a real campground helped make the setting feel really authentic, and Harry Manfredini's score is a ton of fun. Alice makes for a pretty solid final girl. I wouldn't say she's quite Laurie Strode standard, but she helped set the bar for many films to come. I do wish there was a little more foreshadowing to Mrs. Voorhees being the villain, as there is just so little mention of Jason's drowning it seems like an afterthought. If the sequels never happened, I wonder how this weird little film about a vengeful mother would be remembered. All in all though, Friday the 13th is fun, but it's ultimately pretty run-of-the-mill as far as 80s slashers go. I think there are a lot of films that came before and after Friday that are scarier, more effective whodunits, way better paced, and just more original and fun. But I'm only being this critical because it's a film that is so beloved and helped create one of the greatest horror franchises of all time. It helped to cement the sex equals death component of slashers, it introduced a great new location with a campground setting, and it has a few standout kills. It's not my favorite of the franchise, but it's a film I always appreciate revisiting. Well, that's about it. I'll be back soon to revisit Friday Part 2, but first we've got to check out John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness. This should be a fun one. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Friday the 13th. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks, y'all.